Hi, welcome to our panel discussion on rural journalism. I'm Ben Shores, Chair of the Department of Journalism and Media Production at the Murrow College, and I'm really excited about this discussion today, in which we'll discuss prevailing narratives about people in rural communities, and we'll also explore ideas about how we can better improve coverage and representation of rural populations. So I want to introduce the panelists today. Enrique Cerna is a member of WSU's Board of Regents and a former public television broadcaster and documentary filmmaker. He is also a member of the Rural News Initiative, sponsored by Northwest Public Broadcasting, and he works to assist Washington State University in better engaging with underserved populations. He's a first-generation college graduate from Wapato, Washington. Professor Jennifer Sherman is the author of several books, including the forthcoming book, Dividing Paradise, Rural Inequality and the Diminishing American Dream. Dr. Sherman has studied poverty and inequality in rural communities from New England to Northern California, and of course here in Washington State. Georgiana Ausen is Assistant Director of the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, which works to build and create a news system that can respond to information gaps in American Indian communities in the Great Plains. She's also a former assistant director of Vision Maker Media, which is the country's leading source of public media about and by Native American filmmakers. And finally, we're joined by Professor Lisa Waananen Jones, who is a scholarly assistant professor at the Murrow College. And she is the organizer of our Rural Plunge, which sends WSU journalism students into rural communities in Washington State and Idaho. Professor Jones also works as a graphics reporter for the New York Times, including her most recent efforts to improve data visualization of COVID-19 cases in rural areas. That was a lot for me to get through, but let me just say welcome to all the panelists and thank you for joining us. I want to begin by talking about problems with existing narratives about rural populations. And to do that, I'd like to make 2 points. One, I am from a small town in northern Montana, and I'm a terrible fly fisherman. So if you associate Montanans with fly fishing, that's the first myth we'll bust today. Second, I live just outside of Pullman, and I do not have reliable internet at all times. So if I freeze, please proceed. What I'd like to do, though, is 2 parts. First, to establish that there are problems with our understanding of rural populations, and that 2, we can create more accurate, more responsive media ecosystems and media narratives to better represent the complexity and diversity within those rural populations. So each of you have come into this conversation through your own perspectives, and I wonder if we might start by having you each talk a little bit about how you came into these ideas around rural journalism, rural communication, and rural narratives. And I'm going to start with Enrique. Enrique's hometown is Wapato, Washington, and it's a great example of diversity in rural communities, including in the early 20th century, the influence of Japanese Americans in Wapato, and obviously a growing Hispanic population. Enrique, you entered into a broadcast career at a time when there were few Mexican-American broadcasters. And I wonder what led you into this field and what you've learned in your 30 plus years of communicating.
Well, thank you for having me to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate it. For those of you, Wapato is a small town, rural town in central Washington. It's outside of Yakima, Washington, which is a kind of a bigger place in central Washington. As a kid, I always had an interest in news and current events. I was a little odd. And growing up, I just kept that interest. And to be honest with you, when I went to WSU, I really didn't know that much about Edward R. Murrow and the college and all those things. I thought I wanted to be a teacher, but I found my way into a communications class, and that sort of changed things for me. And then I decided I wanted to be a news reporter, and that's how I went in that direction. And I, to be honest with you, I think I was the only Mexican American in the department through the whole time I was there. Coming from a small town like the Yakima Valley, or a small area like the Yakima Valley, I think that one of the things that, and then going to Seattle, where my first job, and I spent my career working in Seattle, I always found a bit of a bias about this kind of East-West thing, and that a big city like Seattle, which is really a big city now, not really being aware of the rural areas that weren't in Western Washington, or and really looking at what was happening in Central and Eastern Washington. And through my career, I always tried to find stories on the other side of the mountains to bring some awareness. And I think that was one of the big challenges for in our business, is to not blow off rural areas, because the people there have they have a lot of voices. They, contribute to the economy. And then, as we've seen politically, they've made a difference in some elections. So, and I think more and more now we need to be aware of those voices. And but one of the problems I think we have in media today is that we have some trust issues, and that's something that we really need to break down. Also, with a lot of diversity, like in the Yakima Valley, the Wapto is located on the Yakima Indian Reservation, but you also have a growing Latino population. My grandfather settled there in 1940. Now I think it's in the Yakima County, it's close to 50% of the population that are Latinos. So you have to keep that in mind as well, because they're a growing population and they need to have a voice as well. So trust, communicating, bringing awareness, and that's a challenge that I think that we have in the media business, and money. That's always an issue.
Jennifer, you're also from a rural area on a different side of the country, but your work explores a lot of the inequalities in rural population, but also narratives that persist about rural populations. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that specifically, and how that brought you into your work as a sociologist.
Yeah. So I'm probably the only one here who's not a journalist, but my original interest was in poverty, and within sociology, I really felt like our understandings were very biased towards urban populations and didn't always represent what was going on in rural areas. And among the various misunderstandings I've encountered over time, I think are, that the populations I work with, which tend to be mostly white and native, that they are ignorant, that they are unaware of their own best interests, that they are somehow deluded or backwards. But also, some of my earliest work was in timber country in Northern California. And in order to gain access to that community, the first question I often had to get through people before I could proceed with an interview was, are you a journalist? Are you with a newspaper? And the reason they wanted to know that before they would talk to me is that they felt that they had been badly misrepresented, particularly during the timber wars period, through mainstream media outlets like the LA Times, like the San Francisco Chronicle, where they would send reporters out there. They'd get some really great sound bites of these guys talking about how they needed to go back to work, and then portray them as kind of anti-environmentalist and tree hating, as violent, as ignorant, etc. And really underrepresenting the complexity of their lives and their perspectives. They were people often who had multiple generations, long-standing ties to this place and these natural amenities, and did not want to see them destroyed, but did want a way to provide for their families and to make sure that they were allowed to survive in the places that they loved. And I have long found that popular representations of rural communities oversimplifies both the structural conditions that create the struggles, and their often very complex reactions to them.
Yeah. Georgiana, your work, when we talk about media representations, your work with Native populations, perhaps one of the most damaging representations in any rural population, but particularly starts with this idea that Native people only exist in rural populations, which creates some of its own problems. But Native people first demonized in many media narratives, and then idealized. And I wonder what brought you into the world of media, and how you've found your place within this broader media system.
Sure, that's a great question. Let me introduce myself first for those who are listening. Yat esh a Georgiana Ausen Yanishya, Tohanen Nishle, Totlotni Bashashin, Kia Ani Dashanella, Do Touchitni Dashache. I'm from the Navajo Nation, and I grew up in a small town. It's actually considered a border town, just on the edge of the reservation. And I had always had an interest in storytelling, but my storytelling really started in high school when I was started working in a video production course and video production classroom. And one of my first story that really opened up my interest to journalism was about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. It was about the RECA bill that was not being implemented across the Navajo Nation, where Native American workers were working in uranium mines and not being compensated for the after effects of cancer being ridden amongst their family and themselves and generations to follow. And so, that story was being untold. And I was astonished at that age just by how much I didn't know about this and how so many of us were being impacted by it. And I went on into college with that interest in journalism to be able to tell stories. And I wanted that liberal education to be able to build a foundation for me before I entered into the film world. And so I'm really happy that I did go study journalism at a young age and then went into narrative filmmaking, where we focused on documentary filmmaking and storytelling by and about Native Americans. I'm very fortunate that in my career, I've been doing nothing but focusing on Native stories by and about Native Americans and being supportive of that. So it's really in my heart to be able to tell our Native stories from a Native perspective. And I think that that's just really goes to the core of what you're talking about. So,
Lisa, your work and your background, I believe, extends a couple generations in Pullman, but your work looks at visual representation of rural populations as well. How did you find yourself along this track in your career, and what do you find it rewarding about rural journalism?
Thanks, Ben. So I got into rural journalism as a student at WSU, which is where I did my undergrad, and partly that was because that's what you have when you're at Washington State University. And my family is from Pullman. I didn't grow up here, though. I grew up in the suburbs of Minnesota. And so it was always interesting to me that Pullman felt like home, but realizing as I got older that I didn't actually know that much about the community, especially beyond the city boundaries. Once you go to Ferdinand's and visit the bears and stuff, I didn't know much beyond that. And so as an instructor, that was also really striking to me, how many students were either from similar backgrounds or often from small towns, sometimes from really urban areas, and didn't really know what was going on outside of College Hill a lot of the time. And what a loss that is, because we have such a lot of, really great resources. And so a lot of my work has been about how do we try to tell those stories and get students out there without being extractive, right? It's not just some fun, outdoorsy park where you can just go dash around and see what's happening and, assume that everybody's going to be happy to see you and want to share their story just because you showed up. And so I think a lot of my work has been related to that, and visuals are particularly fraught when it comes to stereotypical representations. So that's something that I've focused on just as kind of where my work intersects. And we also have so many really talented visual journalists at our college. And there are some really great role models out there for them, but it's sometimes hard to find. So that's something that I think I'm trying to work toward, and still involves a lot of learning on my part along with them.
I want to open it up to a more general question, which is, we have a concentration of media in metropolitan areas, particularly along the coasts and in more populated areas. Of course, in rural areas, we've seen a decline in the number of media publications and newspapers and coverage of those rural areas. What are the stories that we're missing here? I think we often, when we see metropolitan or larger publications cover rural issues, we see stories about, look at the weird things that are happening in these communities, or we see idealized versions of rural communities and rural life, or we just see stories of this sort of wild, untouched place. And I'm wondering, outside those three buckets, what are the stories that we're missing? And I'm going to start with George to maybe talk a little bit about what happens when we simplify those narratives, and what are the stories that we're missing?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that some of the stories that we're missing right now, are particularly in Indian country, have to do around not only COVID, but also like what are, as Native people, what are we doing spiritually, culturally, to be able to get through this period of COVID. And I think that that's one of the reasons why our company, Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance and Buffalo's Fire, why we're focusing on a COVID messages of reason is what we're calling it. And it's really a way for us to look at the way that Native Americans are leaning toward their spiritual ways to be able to thrive through this period of time and be able to take care of ourselves spiritually, emotionally, physically, and really look at the core of who we are as human beings, and still try to be impactful and purposeful in what we're doing in life. So I feel like that's that kind of gets up to the core of what I feel like we're trying to focus on right now.
Jennifer, same question. What are the stories that we're missing or that are underrepresented about rural communities in larger publications or media?
I mean, I think you're right that often rural communities they're portrayed in kind of one of two ways. The communities themselves are either pristine and idyllic and peaceful, sort of over idealized version of rural communities, or they are often portrayed as really depressed, really downtrodden, despairing. And I think both of these sort of extreme portrayals tend to miss not only the complexity of the human populations, but also the interactions between rural and urban America. So I think for me, one of the biggest problems with the kind of dehumanizing treatment of rural populations in particular is that it lets urban populations off the hook in terms of caring about their concerns, in terms of worrying about their experiences, and in terms of seeing themselves as either implicated or responsible for fixing whatever problems rural populations experience. So it allows you to write off the people as kind of individually or community level responsibility for whatever they're experiencing, without thinking about, okay, to what degree are the structures of our society responsible here? To what degree are our dependence on extractive industries without proper compensation to the communities or the people that work in them responsible for what these folks are going through? It's very easy to write off the people as just kind of ignorant or racist or whatever your stereotype is, and then wash your hands of them and say, it's not our fault. They're just, they deserve whatever's going on. And for me, that's one of the biggest problems and things that's just missing from our portrayals.
The media loves messages of individuals overcoming systems, whether it's hillbilly elegy or anything else. And it does let us off the hook in a certain extent, to a certain extent, if we can say, here is one individual who's overcome these structural systemic problems. And therefore, if this person can do it, everybody within that community should. And Jennifer, I wonder if you want to amplify that or expand on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only that everybody can, but that everybody should. That, obviously the opportunity is there, and the failure to seize it is your failure, not societal failure, not society's responsibility. And I think that is that's a very American understanding it more generally, but I think we really turn it on rural communities, in part because they are sort of otherized and exoticized. It's very easy to not relate to them. You can relate to your own problems if you're not living in them. And the reality is most media is coming out of urban areas, and it's mostly pitched towards urban populations. Rural communities are seldom the main targets of mainstream media. You know, they're sort of just an exotic story once in a while. They're not the main story, and they're not the main audience.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and I want to come back to that in just a second. But Enrique, you did have to overcome, or at least find your own path forward. You didn't have a lot of people in mainstream media, at least when you were coming up, with who had Mexican American heritage. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the individual stories like that we love to celebrate, and then the really thorny systemic problems that we prefer to maybe hold off making changes on those.
When I first got into the business and started working in Seattle, I'd have to say that we didn't really look outside of Seattle or Western Washington for much of the coverage that was done. It was kind of what has been mentioned here, was just an occasional thing that happened, unless there was a big forest fire or some type of, catastrophic event. But rarely did it became more of a novelty kind of to go, to a small community. I think as things changed and more people like me came into the business from rural areas, but also came from diverse backgrounds, we worked to make our voices heard, so that our communities and people of color were having more representation. And the same thing, having come from like the Yakima Valley, I actually always tried to pitch stories that were from where I grew up, partly because it was what I knew, but also they were good stories. I was just looking for a good story. But I think one of the challenges that just I mentioned money because it's there, the financial part of things for media and for the business these days is it's a tough sell. And, local journalism is facing a lot of issues financially just to exist. But I think one of the big challenges too has been just its consistency. It's like, okay, if we're going to cover issues statewide, are we going to consistently have someone looking in Central Washington or Eastern Washington if you're based in Seattle? And that's something that, again, I think is tied to, depending on availability. Daily News probably isn't going to do that unless it's a forest fire or something like that. They have more opportunity now because there's just much more availabilities with a phone and everything else. But I think that if we're really going to make a difference to have voices heard from rural areas, you have to make the commitment. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to do with this rural journalism initiative, is to say that, we really need to put some money into this, really work to build trust, and to have a voice and to make sure that those voices are heard. So that's where the big challenge is, I think, more than anything else, and the consistency that those voices are going to be heard, and not just in a novel way, but when major issues are happening, what are people in those communities facing and feeling and having to deal with consistently? So, and there are good stories there, and I think you should look at it that way, as a good story. And what's a good story to cover, whether it is a story that has pain in it or whatever, it would be the same reason you're covering it in an urban area. So that's, I think, one of the big challenges, and something that hopefully, with this rural journalism initiative, that we're going to try to tackle.
I think that's a wonderful point, Enrique, and Jennifer has made this point as well. We almost cover rural populations as if they're foreign countries outside of mainstream America, and we look for conflict, or we look for strangeness, and we highlight this sort of almost otherness to rural populations. Lisa likes to say that we produce, or that the media produces stories about rural populations rather than for rural populations. And Lisa, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, and how do we produce media for rural populations?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. Everyone's raised some really important issues here. And I see we've also had some questions related to politics and having informed voters. And I think all these issues are really related. I think one significant problem with the way that rural communities are covered right now is that so much of it is based on what we see in national media, and the needs in national media are just very different from what people need in local media. And that's true because we have, I mean, it really comes down to local elections, right? You can't have the same coverage for everybody because the issues are different depending on what level you are living in, really. And so I see that as a big barrier. We are losing local coverage in a lot of places, not just rural areas. And those are often where you're getting that really important information about what's going on in your town and the end of your street and building permits and elections and a lot of the stuff that is not ever going to be important enough to elevate to a larger audience, really. I mean, even we've had issues with that with regional media. They don't care about like a minor conflict about a building permit in one small town, but if you live there, it's really, really important. And we don't have a good way of doing all those things in our current industry setup. And in fact, I mean, that's true any place because we just don't have enough people keeping track at the local level. And that's something that we talk about a lot without a lot of great solutions for it other than money, which we don't have. But I think that that's something that I've seen a lot of really good ideas coming. And I think we might see a shift as well because there's, well, I'm hopeful we'll see a shift where media is not as tied to large population centers and the coasts, especially as a result of the pandemic. I think that could be one good thing to come out of this, because there are a lot of media organizations realizing that it is beneficial to have reporters and people on the ground in a lot more places. And that's true even in small newsrooms, right? Like even if your big city is 50,000 people, you don't need everybody living in that community to be a valuable contributor to that newsroom. So I'm hopeful we'll see more geographic diversity of reporters, and that might naturally in some ways lead to better civic coverage of smaller areas. But I don't know that there's ever going to be a way to say all media is solved at all levels. I mean, I think there just are different needs that we need to address in different ways.
Can I bring up something, Ben? I think that we need to look at different ways of not just kind of our old traditional ways of coverage. We need to think of new approaches. And I think that one way of doing that, podcasting is one way of doing it, kind of vignettes that focus on a community. More and more people are, it's kind of a danger in some respects, are doing their own media production because, you know, you want the quality of it. You can have some concern and I suppose the points of view, but then I think, you know, that's just the way it is. But there are more opportunities, I think, if because just the technology of things are changing, and we're seeing today more and more about the impact of, you know, that cell phones have had on the racial reckoning that's going on in America today. And so for different communities, I think there's different ways of looking at how you could do this. And I think for students, you know, that might be an option, you know, to look at a podcast about what is happening in the communities, you know, maybe from their hometown or something like that. And so there are different ways to tackle this. And I think it's again one of those things of keeping those. One thing that COVID, I think, has taught a lot of us is that, or forced upon us, is that we've had to find alternative ways of doing things. And like I'm sitting in my condo living room, you know, doing this conversation, and I got a ring light. And, you know, over the past year, I don't know how much money I've spent on gear, you know, just because I started doing this stuff. And so there's new ways that we have to look at these approaches. And I see more young people today that have those abilities technologically to do things that we dinosaurs like me could use help with. But I mean, it's the things we need to think of different ways of approaching these things too. And if you come from a small community, think of what you can bring to the table if you work in an urban place. And don't be shy about, going to who your boss is if you're producing stories or whatever, and say, hey, I'm from this area, whatever. I constantly did that to the point where I was probably a real pain in the ass for most people. But, I did a documentary in 2013 when I was at KCTS about the Latino population in Washington State, called Latinos, the Changing Face of Washington. I mean, I'd been in the business for, almost 40 years then before I got to do that documentary. And but sometimes it's just perseverance, but I think more and more of us from different backgrounds, we've got to use those experiences we've had and bring that to the table. That's what's important about the diversity in our newsrooms, but also about the diversity of where we come from. So I think that that's a real important thing.
It's a great point, Enrique. We're getting some really great questions in the chat, and so I want to address a couple of those. And George, I wonder if you might address this question from a student who grew up in a city and hasn't been exposed to rural places or to rural people. And what are some things that this student should keep in mind when reporting in or for rural areas? And I'll let you take that in any direction you want to, George.
Sure. I think just because I'm Native American and I'm more familiar with the indigenous communities, I think it's always important that, when you're coming in and as an outsider to this community, an indigenous community, I feel like it's important to always get to know the people first, always, and not just jump right into the process of reporting, but to actually get to know the individual, to get to know the family, really engage with the family and the people, because I feel like that's community engagement on a level of reporting where you're engaging the community and giving voice to these people. And I think it's important also to let them know that you're there for a good reason and what your purpose is there, and making that very clear and gaining trust. Those are just steps of gaining trust to someone in the community that you're not familiar with. And so I think it's just really important to be able to listen very well, and to take things slow and not just jump right into the reporting. So I think that's like that's just 101 right there, and just one of the key factors, I think, in really gaining the public's trust. So I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, listening, building relationships, investing time. Jennifer, when you started working on your project, your book in Northern California, you had to overcome some of those barriers as an outsider with this sort of etic approach to storytelling. How did you begin to work in those communities, and what did you learn from that process?
I think some of the process was a lot like what Georgiana just described, just needing to take some time to get to know the people, to establish myself as willing to listen, as not coming there with a lot of preconceived notions that I wanted to put upon them. And I think that's, to me, kind of the first step, is recognizing that we all have biases, that we all come into the world with preconceived notions, and trying to recognize what those are and put them aside, and then take the time to really get to know the people. So that project, my first real ethnographic community, it took a lot of time just living there, just working around people, getting myself involved in different activities. I worked with the schools, I worked with a local group that was trying to work on economic development issues. And I just spent a lot of time watching and listening and getting to know people, and being patient. And it took a lot of time to build a level of trust in this place, and to really establish that I'm not a journalist who's going to run back to the city and paint a picture of you as, just bloodthirsty, want to kill trees. but rather that I'm somebody who is interested in hearing your stories from your perspective and understanding how they all fit together and understanding what you've been through and humanizing that. So I do think just taking the time to get to know people, particularly if they're not like you. I did have a rural background myself, but it wasn't in that community, and understanding rural communities well enough to know that it doesn't matter if you're from another one, it's not the same as this one. They're all different and they're all individual, and you're not part of that community until you've been there for 40 years. And just, taking that time to get to know people, I think was hugely important, and important in every project I do.
Yeah, and often journalists, as many here on this panel know, do face things like deadlines. And so it's that balance between what is the story I need today versus what is the story that I tell over the course of my career, so that I can return to these communities and continue to tell stories and invest in those narratives. Lisa, you have a project where you send about 50 WSU students into rural communities for 24 hours, and then they come back. Talk to us about what you've learned about preparing students for that experience, and also what you've learned from students about it.
Yeah, thank you. So this is one of our key events that we did for 2 years, and we had to suspend that form of it this year, of course, with the travel restrictions. And Ben named it, by the way, the Rural Plunge is his name for it. But we decided this was meant to be almost a little bit gimmicky when we started it, where we said, okay, instead of having students do all this research ahead of time, we're just going to send them there, and we're not even going to tell them where they're going until the day that they leave. And what they need to do then in 24 hours is just be in the community. They need to find some place to eat dinner. They need to spend time with each other. They need to ask questions of people. And what we did to prepare them was partnered with libraries in small towns and had them sort of in many ways help prepare the town, right? So that the students weren't showing up and surprising everyone, and also helping us collect some ideas for people they might talk to, places they might want to go. And we wanted to build it that way just because we suspected that the ideas that would come organically from a community might not be the same things that you would see if you Google a small town or look it up or make assumptions based on the demographics you see online. And when we've talked to professional journalists about this, they usually find this concept really terrifying, or in some cases, even disrespectful, right? What are you doing showing up in a place without knowing much about it? But we found that it's been mostly positive, and the students have been really great about it. We don't usually say like, hey, you're doing a thing that most professionals would find terrifying. And because of that, they've approached it really respectfully, and they have to go in basically knowing that they don't know anything and they need to trust what people tell them. And it's created, I think, an interesting dynamic. Along with that, they are encouraged to take photos and find story ideas, but we don't say you have to complete a story while you're there. It's really meant to be more exploratory. And a lot of times students do come back with some really great story ideas, and we'll follow up on those later. But there's no pressure to immediately start producing journalism when they get to a place they've never been to. I think that has been really interesting for us to see, and perhaps instructive for professionals as well. And I think it's also helped students get over that feeling that like whenever you go someplace, people should immediately like you. There's no reason really that they should, and how to still talk to people and find out what's going on, even if even if they aren't necessarily thrilled that you're there all the time. In most cases, they've been very welcoming. I have seen some, questions, and I was actually really thrilled when I was looking at the list of people who are here today and in our audience, that we have some of the students who participated even in the first year when it was still a little bit, we weren't really sure what we were doing, which they probably realized after the fact. And it was, I mean, it was meant to be an experiment, and it really was. And there were concerns. Yasmin mentions, that journalists of color might not feel comfortable in all these places. And that was something that I took very seriously. I mean, we made sure that we didn't have teams of students who were going to be all students of color traveling together to places where we weren't sure how they might be received, because that is a legitimate fear. And every time I think like, oh, we're overthinking this again, there's some story about like the family who got attacked when they were camping last year. And I think, okay, we do need to take that seriously, even while also trusting that most of these communities are going to be really welcoming and thrilled to see our students. And so we kind of have to balance a lot of those different needs. But it's been really good for students, I think, to start questioning their own ideas of where they're going, even when they don't know what it's going to be like. And we've also had good reception from people in the towns too, who like interacting with our students. And often our students are not what they expect either. They expect these like privileged, grew up in some like huge house in Seattle kind, and that's not, we have some students are from privileged backgrounds, but that's not the majority of our student body at WSU. So it's been a good exchange, I think.
Can I address the issue of if you're a person of color and you might be going into some place you don't feel comfortable, which I've done I don't know how many times, and also have done it with a full crew of, my crew's all people of color. And I've been in rural places. I've been in the South and other places where I, walked into a cafe and the place stops, and then they, and you walk back to the car afterwards that, hey, did you see that? Yeah, I saw that. Let's get out of here. Anyway, I do think, if you're going to be in a situation like that, particularly if you're working either by yourself or, you're working with a crew that is of color, you need to be aware these days of what the climate might be. I mean, it's sad to say, but right now we are in a tough time in this country in that respect, that you have to be aware of that. And I would say too, if you're going to be doing that type of work, that you let people know what you're doing and where you're going to be and those types of things. Take some precautions there. The other thing I would say is that, and Lisa, you said this numerous times about, your students going into a community, be respectful. And I think same thing that Georgiana mentioned about, research. Take some time to find out if you're going to go someplace or whatever that you don't know about. Take some time to find out about the place and make some calls. Sometimes you can work on a story that you're not going to get to right away, but it's something that you'll work on for a while. When I did the documentary about Latinos, that's something that I had in mind for years before I got the opportunity to do it. So, do what a lot of reporters do. You keep a file on something that you have an interest in, but then research those things, see about what is it, or people that you meet that might make a good story, and then put it in your bank and that you can go back to it at a different time. But the other thing I think is really important, be respectful no matter what you're doing. Journalists today, we're kind of like Congress. We don't have the best image out there. Our ratings, I don't know what our ratings would be, but probably not great. But the thing is that don't be a jerk with people and don't think you know everything, and don't be condescending, because you're not going to, that doesn't serve you well at all. If you want to be a jerk, go do something else. But the thing is that you really need to be understanding that you're asking somebody to open up to you. So be respectful, try to be understanding, even if you don't agree with them. I mean, I've had situations where I've interviewed people that they didn't want to be interviewed and they didn't want me interviewing them. So, and then they start chewing me out about, oh, you cover things badly. So, what I've tried to do a lot of times, okay, well, tell me your story that you're so hung up on. And then I don't say it like that, but I try to just say, okay, tell me what it is that what will you want to say? And I've actually had that work out pretty well. But be respectful when you're going into a community, and research and prepare yourself. As you'll gain a lot that way.
So many great questions here in the chat, and I'm going to try to consolidate a couple of them. But it brings up this question of rural values and small town values, which is a great media trope, both in the sense of that everyone has the same values within those communities, and there are some wonderful community values. George co-produced a film that I did on the Blackfeet Reservation, where we saw these incredible communities. And then there are other communities, again, that may be incredibly exclusive, and that those values might not be things that we want to celebrate, and ought not be celebrated. I wonder how we talk about values within small rural communities, and if we're doing it in a healthy way, or if we need to recognize that there are, just like in any community, there are problematic values in small towns. Jennifer, can you help us muddle through this?
I think it's definitely really complicated. It's a great question. I think on the one hand, yeah, most rural communities do have their own cultural norms, their own sets of values, and they are often quite distinct from those in other places. I think we often, at the same time, tend to overgeneralize and oversimplify what we see as rural cultural value systems. There's sort of a homogenization that goes on at least at the national consciousness level, where we sort of assume all rural people think alike. And beyond that, I think that there's an assumption that rural culture tends to be somewhat static. And I spend a lot of time countering that in my work, because it just doesn't match what I find on the ground. The reality I find is that while absolutely rural communities have their own understandings that are rooted in their places, in their shared experiences, in their long-standing traditions, they also do live in our world and are acting and reacting, interacting with what's going on in the larger nation, the larger world, the larger media discussions, and the larger political spectrum. And often they're moving targets, just like our cultural values are. And I think one of the risks we take in a lot of the portrayal of rural communities is in kind of reifying whatever cultural norms we find at that moment, and assuming that those are both universal, in terms of all rural communities must think like that, and assuming that that's just static, and that that's just how it's always going to be, and that there's, that our actions at the national or political level didn't somehow create what we're finding on the ground. And that's often what I try to look at, is that interaction between what's going on in the larger nation and the larger, set of discourses, and what we're seeing in the rural communities, and how a lot of what we see is an interaction effect, not simply innate to these populations that have different experiences, but it's complex.
That's a wonderful point. George, I'm wondering if you might respond to this idea of values, and these ideas of Native people as static. There's obviously a lot of well-meaning ideas and efforts to preserve culture, but sometimes when we preserve culture, we freeze it in amber, and we don't let it evolve, or we don't recognize its evolution. And we've seen this in Native cultures as well. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. And I think I wanted to speak a little bit to what Jennifer was talking about as well, in that, Native communities are they're different, and it's not to say that all Native communities are the same, and that if you walk into one reservation, it's going to be similar to this other reservation. Reservations are all very different. Tribal communities are all very different and unique in their values. And I think that it's and I say that because I'm Navajo, and I'm from the Navajo Nation, and I understand some of the values that are in our community. But when you back when I used to work on the Obama campaign, and they put me on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation up in Montana, I had to learn a whole nother set of values just based off that tribe and what their values were. And they were very similar, but still different. And the traditions were a little different too. Some of the ceremonies are different. The language is different. And so it's really unique in that way. And I think that, we're talking about rural journalism, and we're talking about going into these communities and telling the stories. And I think that's really important to know that, like kind of what Enrique was saying, is having that level of respect amongst yourself and within yourself when you go into these communities, because there are going to be differing opinions at times, and sometimes they can be very startling. But I think it's really important to realize that it's okay, and that it's okay to sit across an individual, have differing opinions, but to still tell their story. That's what we're here for, is to be storytellers, and to listen. So I just think that that's really important. I wanted to point that out as well.
I'm wondering if we might wrap up by asking each of the panelists how we become better storytellers, or how we promote or engage better in storytelling with rural communities. And Lisa, maybe you could lead us off in terms of how we engage with these communities.
Sure. I think I really like teaching this because there's so many opportunities to do it better. Frankly, I think our students are in many ways better prepared after a year or 2 years of thinking about this and doing it in our program compared to many professionals who have, prestigious positions nationally. And so I think that's a real strength that we have, but also something that needs to expand. And I think a lot of it just comes down to experience and comfort level. And that's something that can come from having more journalists from the communities that they are covering. It can come through better training for people who are not from those communities. But I think that there needs to be a more specific effort to do better. Otherwise, we do fall back too often on, especially sort of the political stories, which is such a really a minor part of life anywhere, but often the only time that rural communities get elevated to national stories. I think a lot of it comes from asking students and journalists to just ask better questions. And sometimes we do that better even teaching it in international journalism than we do in our own nation. And so I think we've borrowed a lot of ideas from some of our international reporting trips locally, and that's been a successful thing too, because it helps get everyone in the mindset of being there to learn and not come in with a lot of assumptions or go to the easy stereotype and then leave.
Enrique, your work with Northwest Public Broadcasting, trying to tackle this issue of how do we do better in rural communities with our media coverage, advice?
I think, as storytellers, it's always kind of to look back at the past. And I think sometimes when we come into a community, I find myself doing this much as late in my career, looking back at, I left an area and then I kind of went back there to find out that history and kind of resurrect that stuff. So I would look at a community and say, okay, what is this place about? And what's the history of this place? And try to dig into that, because you might find a gem there that really helps you understand what the community's about, what they've gone through, just history. Sometimes it's like bringing it back can help you understand the present. So I think sometimes it's worth doing that. It's taking a look at those things. And then also, again, it's that being respectful when you go back, and being a listener, and just let people tell you things, and don't come in there with with judgmental. Just come in there with an open mind to try to find what might be happening there, and listen to what people have to say. And I think you'll probably walk away with some good stuff. But I think more than anything else, just make that effort to try to let those folks tell you what they're all about. It's you're going to find the same thing in an urban area. I think it's everybody's got that thing about history or whatever. We all have our different connections and tribes and things like that. So just keep your mind open, and look for some listen. Just listen. I think more than anything else.
Georgiana, much of your career has been dedicated to finding, fostering, and helping Native storytellers in particular. How do we build on that going forward?
I think it's important to note that, for Indian country, a lot of where we're getting our local news is through our tribal newspapers. And the problem with that is, or the challenge with that is that a lot of times those newspapers are owned by the tribes. And so it creates a little bit of an unbiased look and appeal to the reporting. It provides some inconsistency from the audience's perspective. And I think that for that reason, that's one of the reasons why actually, if you follow Indian country today, they just recently went independent and separated themselves from the National Congress of American Indians to be independent. And so that's a big process or move to progress right there, just as an example. And so I think it's important to know that today what we're trying to do is try to grow our storytellers within the communities themselves and have them tell the stories on an independent medium like Indian Country Today or like Buffalo's Fire. And so it's really important to support independent media in Indian Country for that reason.
That's great. Jennifer, can you speak to this as well? How do we, and I apologize for the not giving you much time here at the end, but how do we better engage with and improve coverage of these rural communities?
Yeah, I mean, I want to mostly just reiterate what the rest of the panel has said. You know, I think respect, listening, and really checking your biases, being aware of your privileges and how they color the way that you're thinking about the population before, during, and after you're talking to people. I would encourage people to assume that the population you're working with has the same level of humanity and dignity as any other population, as your population, as your community, and that, you know, to challenge yourself. If you don't understand something, don't assume that the person talking is irrational, but rather that you're missing part of the story and you need to dig a little bit deeper to figure out, why does that thing that doesn't make sense to me make sense to this person? There's probably a good answer, and it should be on you to uncover that rather than to treat that person or that population as if they are, you know, worthy of being mocked or you know, or just simply treated as if they don't understand what's going on. And I think too often that happens in our treatments of rural populations. So really just thinking about, okay, these people probably have a rational explanation for why they think the way they do. Can I figure, you know, do I have the time to figure out what it is?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. It's also raised in our chat here, this idea that if you're from a rural place, you should escape from that place. That if you live in a rural community, it's because you could not survive in any other place. Instead of recognizing the value and the richness and the complexity within those communities that people might want to embrace. I just want to thank all our panelists for their time today for this discussion. I hope that we can continue this going forward. This is certainly an area that the Murrow College and Northwest Public Broadcasting and many others believe is incredibly important, not just to understand these rural communities, but to also better understand urban communities and their reaction to these communities as well. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for this conversation. And we appreciate your willingness to each and every one of the panelists for joining us. Thank you.